Christian Heroes Then and Now. George Muller. The Guardian of Bristol's Orphans by Janet and Geoff Benge. Chapter 17. The Work Goes On. As George Muller grew older, many people became concerned about what would happen to the orphanage when he died. Some people got up the courage and asked him outright. George always gave the same answer. When it is the Lord's pleasure to remove this servant from my post, people will see that it is I who was dependent on him, and not he who was dependent on me. He can and will easily raise up another servant. And if he acts in accordance with the principles I have learned and lived, the orphan houses will continue to flourish. When George Muller died in 1898, many people predicted that the orphanage would die with him. But George's faith proved them wrong. George's son-in-law, Jim Wright, took over full responsibility for the orphanage. He had, in fact, been managing its day-to-day operation for quite some time. Under his guidance, the orphanage continued to run as it always had. George Muller's pattern was followed exactly. No one but God was ever asked to supply money to keep it running, and the orphans were always well cared for and well loved. Over time, however, social conditions began to change. Public health conditions improved so much from the time George Muller first arrived in Bristol that many of the diseases that had routinely claimed the lives of adults became easily treatable. This meant that there were fewer orphans in Great Britain. By the end of World War II, in 1945, only 180 orphans were living in the huge buildings on Ashley Down. It was decided that these orphans would be better served living in smaller group homes, where they could enjoy more of a family atmosphere. In 1948, the process of selling off the 5 orphan houses began. The houses were all eventually sold to the Bristol Education Authority to be converted into a technical institute. The last orphan left the orphanage on Ashley Down for good in 1958. The money from the sale of the orphan houses was used to buy many smaller homes throughout Bristol and the surrounding countryside. These homes were known as the Muller family homes, in which the orphans lived in more intimate family settings. Some of the money was also used to buy a larger home with a beautiful garden. The home was named Muller House and is still used today as the headquarters of the Muller Foundation. Muller House also contains a small museum, along with all the records of the children who were raised in the orphanage. In the late 1970s, yet another change was made in the way the orphans were cared for. The number of children needing to live in orphanages, even small family-style orphanages, decreased. Since foster homes were seen as a better living situation for these children, the Muller family homes were closed down. But this was not the end of the Muller Foundation. The director and staff searched for ways they could still be useful to children in need. Their solution was to open daycare centers and family support centers where parents and children in need could find help. In 1987, 2 full-time school workers from the foundation were appointed to work in the local schools in Bristol. Their job was to set up Christian groups within schools and be available to lead religious assemblies for public schools. Another ministry was also begun that, in one sense, was the work that George Muller had started come full circle. Beginning in the late 20th century, it has often been the elderly who have needed more help than orphans. In 1983, the Muller Foundation once again bought property and set up homes, this time for elderly people. Some of these elderly people live permanently at Tranquil House or Tilsey House, while others just come for short stays. Some of the people in these homes are Muller children, who as orphans grew up at Ashley Down, and after living productive lives, now need a helping hand in their old age. The work of the Scriptural Knowledge Institution also still goes on. From the beginning, George Muller used money given to him to support many missionaries, including at times whole mission organizations. In 1998, 100 years after George Muller's death, over £400,000 was channeled through the Scriptural Knowledge Institution to missionaries serving in mission fields all over the world. And what of the orphanage buildings themselves? They still stand proudly on Ashley Down, though the city of Bristol has long since grown around them. Today, they are part of the University of the West of England. There is a plan to list them as historic sites so that they can be preserved for future generations. Once a year in September, the university graciously opens up the old No. 3 orphan house to the orphans who once lived there, so that they can hold a reunion and Thanksgiving service. While George Muller would probably have liked to have seen the buildings preserved, and while the buildings hold many special memories for thousands of orphans, the buildings were never the focus of George's work. The children were always the focus. George Muller's heart went out to children in need, and George tried to address those needs as best he could, whether by feeding hungry, homeless children in his own home, or by ordering 500 pairs of shoes at a time for the orphans in his care. The buildings were merely a tool in George Muller's ongoing effort to meet the needs of orphan children. Today, not only is George Muller's work still well known and respected in Bristol, but also over 165 years after George began working with needy children, others still carry on his work in an unbroken chain, praying and striving to meet the needs of children as well as adults.